Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, so welcome to Undeniably Sam.
Welcome to another bedtime story. This is a doozy, you guys. Today we are going to talk about Mary Vincent and Roxanne Hayes. So one trigger warning about today's episode, there will be mentions of rape, assault, and extreme violence. So please just be aware of that as you continue forward. Mary Vincent was born in 1963, and she was one of 7 children, and she lived with her family in Las Vegas, Nevada. She grew up in a military family. If you know anything about military families, they do tend to, and it's not every military family, but they do tend to have stricter rules, which does trickle down to the children. It's just the way that it is in most of these military families. So as Mary got older, wandering into the year 1978, she's about 15 years old, and she was kind of a little bit rebellious, according to a lot of different sources, and just kind of, typical teenager kind of rebelling against her parents' harsh rules. Now, there are some conflicting sources out there. Some sources say that her parents were going through a really messy divorce and that she wanted to run away to kind of escape that situation, while other sources say that really she was just having conflict with her parents and her sister kind of like tipped her off and said, hey, Dad's really pissed off, he's coming home, and she was like, you know what, that's it, I'm done, I'm out of here. Either way, no matter which one is true, Mary Vincent decided that she was just ready to leave. Now, Mary allegedly lived on the streets for a while. Some sources say that she went and lived with her boyfriend. It's not crystal clear if you go and look into it, but ultimately at the end of the day, her grandpa is mentioned, and it was mentioned many times that she wanted to get to his house in Berkeley, California, or that she was ready to go back home. She was tired of being away from just family in general. She was done living from couch to couch, so she decided to go hitchhiking, which may seem really shocking to a lot of us, but hitchhiking was really common in the 60s and 70s, and the 60s and 70s were really scary. That is I think it was the 70s where the term serial killer was even formed. So it's freaky to think about that people were doing this. But anyway, so she's 15 years old. She's on Interstate 5 trying to find a ride, and she's standing with these 2 other girls when this blue van pulls up. We're already in creepy territory, right? So this blue van pulls up. The guy in the van said, hey, I can only take one of you, which, first of all, huge red flag. You're in a freaking van, for hell's sakes. I don't know why you would only be taking one. But, despite the girl's warnings saying, telling Mary, I don't think it's a good idea that you go with him, Mary really needed a ride. And she thought, you know what? He's old, it'll be fine. So Mary jumps in the car. So let's talk a little bit about Lawrence Singleton. Now, I'll say right now, we don't know a lot about his early life. He was born back in 1927. So, do the math thing, it's 1978. And he really was just described by people as being a really angry drunk. And that's pretty much all that I feel like we need to know about Lawrence Singleton, to be perfectly honest with you. So back to the creepy blue van. So they're driving in this van, and very shortly into the drive, Lawrence misses a turn that Mary knows should have been taken, and she kind of says something to him, and he plays dumb and says, oh, I'm sorry, that's my mistake, and they get back onto Interstate 5 and continue driving on the path that Mary knows they should be taking. Then later in the drive, and it's, not determined how far into the drive this was, but later into the drive, Lawrence is like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom, and she's kind of like, okay. So they pull off on Del Puerto Road, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's dark outside, and he gets out of the car to go do his thing, and she kind of gets out of the car saying, oh yeah, I could use some fresh air. And as she's sitting there tying her shoe, she's starting to catch on that all of this is a little bit weird. And she's thinking, he is older than me. In her mind, she's like, he is old enough to be my grandpa. I could just take off and run. But before Mary could finish that thought, she felt a very extreme blow to the back of her head. Lawrence Singleton had struck her with a hammer. And it always blows my mind when I hear about people being attacked with a hammer or being hit in the head with a hammer when they are still able to get up from that. It doesn't make sense to me, but it just blows my mind what the human body is capable of taking. And after hitting her, Lawrence begins to brutally rape her. It gets worse, as if anybody could even imagine that. It does get worse. Lawrence went back to the van and grabbed something that Mary didn't quite know what exactly he was grabbing. And when he came back over to her, he picked her up, and that's when she realized that what he had grabbed from the van was in fact a hatchet. Her own account goes as follows, quote, "He told me, 'You want to be set free? I'll set you free.' And that's when he picked up a hatchet and took off my left arm. I grabbed his arm, or at least I thought I did, and I couldn't figure out why I was still falling. That's when I realized that my arm was not there. There was just tons of blood squirting out. I felt all of the pain, the sharpness, the burning. I felt the hot ooze flowing out of me. I felt everything. I was aware of everything. The pain was so excruciating. He then took my right arm and I started kicking and screaming, hoping that someone would hear me. He started to chop my right arm off because I was kicking and screaming, and because of that, he had to keep chopping. When he was done, I lay there bleeding. I could see him at a distance and he was kind of flipping his arms. I couldn't figure out why until I looked closer and noticed that my hand was still clenching onto his arm. At that point, he started to throw me. I think he thought I was dead because I laid still and didn't move, and he threw me off a 30-foot cliff," end quote. Now, this cliff that she was thrown on was actually a culvert, and a culvert is a tunnel carrying a stream or an open drain under like a road or a railroad. Either way, it was 30 feet down that he threw her. Now, Lawrence Singleton was so convinced that what he had done was so brutal that she had to be dead. So he simply climbed into his van and he took off. But oh no, Miss Mary was not dead, not even close. Not only was she not dead, this 15-year-old girl managed to muster up the energy after she started piecing together what she had gone through and bringing everything back to where she was at in that moment. She pulled herself up and then took the spots where her arms once were, dipped them into the mud to try to slow the bleeding. What? Okay, Mary, we see you. Not only did she do that, but then she proceeded to walk 3 miles, a good chunk of that mileage being just getting out of that culvert. So as she's trekking down the road, holding up what is left of her mutilated arms up above her head to try to slow the bleeding, we're now wandering into the next early morning hours when a couple sees her walking down the road, immediately scoops her up and takes her to a nearby hospital. Not only was Mary so badass through this entire thing, she gets to the hospital and manages to tell the police such a detailed account of not only what happened to her, but what he looked like to such detail that when they released the sketch, Lawrence's neighbor called and said, "That's my neighbor." That is how Lawrence Singleton was found by police. And just a quick side note, I know it's very easy to see things or to kind of think that, maybe I might know that person. Everyone has Ring cameras now. When they see something, if they see someone in the footage, it might be very easy to think, okay, maybe that can't be the person that I'm thinking of. Just call, because As we in the true crime fan world know, you don't know people. You just don't. So just call, because if this neighbor hadn't called, who knows when Lawrence Singleton would have been found or if he ever would have been found. Now, the trial didn't take place until March of 1979, which was about 6 months after the attack on Mary Vincent. And although Mary Vincent technically did survive, she didn't feel like a survivor. This attack left her in extreme depression. It left her with extreme PTSD. She had nightmares constantly. She had had hopes and dreams of becoming a dancer, but when they went to do the reconstructive surgery on her arms, they actually had to use pieces of her legs that would make it to where she would never be able to dance again. Ultimately, over time, and we'll talk about it a little more in a minute, but she was unable to hold a job later on in life. It was hard for her to be able to afford replacement prosthetics. She ultimately had to file bankruptcy, and it really impacted her life in the biggest way. But by the time Singleton was on trial in March of 1979, obviously Mary was the only witness to these horrific crimes, so she had to get up on the stand and talk to a room full of people about all of the brutal things that Lawrence did to her. Now, I want you all to prepare yourselves to get really pissed off, because the laws in California at this time were quite lenient for crimes such as rape, kidnapping, all of the things that he was being accused of. He was found on multiple charges as guilty: kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. The maximum amount of time that they could give him for these crimes ended up being only 14 years. So now you have a judge who doesn't make the laws, but he has to enforce them. That judge had to look at young Mary Vincent sitting in that courtroom with her now prosthetic arms. He had to look her in the face and say, I know what he did to you. I've heard everything that he's done to you. I know that he's guilty, but I can only give him 14 years. And even worse than the sentence itself, he may have gotten 14 years, but after 8 years and 4 months, Lawrence Singleton was released from prison for good behavior. If that is not the biggest example of failed justice, I don't know what is. So because Lawrence Singleton wasn't successful in murdering Mary Vincent when she was just 15 years old, after he brutally raped her, then continued to dismember her body and throw her down a cliff, I just have no words. I have no words. So shortly before he was released on good behavior, though, his psychiatric evaluation read as follows, quote, because he is so out of touch with his hostility and anger, he remains an elevated threat to others' safety inside and outside prison. In addition, while incarcerated, Singleton had written several letters to Vincent's lawyer wherein he threatened her. And this was all also after he said at his trial to Mary, I'll finish this job if it takes me the rest of my life. Now, along with what we mentioned, the psychiatrists that were working with him at the San Quentin prison where he was being incarcerated, they reported that he was a paranoid, severe schizoid and capable of angry and destructive outbursts on people that he felt were weaker than he was. And we let this guy out on good behavior. He was on good behavior because he had no one to torment the way he tormented Mary Vincent while he was behind bars. Of course he's... What? I know that the justice system can't be perfect, but this is just so asinine to me. So when he was paroled, this would have been about the year 1987. He had a hell of a time trying to find a place to live. Everywhere he tried to find a place to live, he was met by picketers and protesters refusing to let him integrate into their communities. People were pissed. People were outraged. It was so shocking that this man would be let out on good behavior. People weren't going to stand for it. They were going to do whatever they could to control it in that moment. During one attempt, there were actually armed guards that escorted Lawrence into a place that he was getting ready to reside, and he was wearing a bulletproof vest. And that just like really confuses me, because I don't know why we're wasting resources after he's been released. I don't understand. Like, how awful for those people that had to escort him, because you know for a fact that they didn't agree with it either. So anyway, after trial and error and no one allowing him in their community, he ended up going back to his home state of Florida. Oh, Florida. I have people that I love very much that live in Florida, but I mean, the stereotype, just even Floridians agree with me. Anyway, so he moves to Florida. He finally settles down, but the guy just continued to do really stupid shit. There was one time where he actually got arrested for stealing a $10 disposable camera and a $3 hat. Like, Anyway, after that, things were a little bit quiet as far as the public knows. As when it comes to Lawrence Singleton, things were a little bit quiet. But then in 1997, he decided to step his game up again and commit another horrific crime. Now we're going to talk about Roxanne Hayes. In 1997, Roxanne Hayes was a 31-year-old mother to 3 children. Her daughter was the oldest, and then she had 2 younger boys with her fiance who was living with her. Roxanne spent most of her life really trying to escape the dark past that was her childhood. She actually was sexually abused by her grandfather, and it was just so bad and so often, and eventually he actually ended up dying in her bedroom one night when she was 6 or 7 years old. It's just, I mean, you just can't even wrap your head around what she has been through by 7 years old. After that, she experienced very extreme physical abuse from her father until she was about 14 years old, at which time her mother passed away. And that is when, as soon as her mom died, she just decided to leave home. So at 14 years old, she was taken in by friends and family. She was able to graduate high school despite some of the trouble she was getting into. And after high school, she continued to get in with the wrong crowd, you could say, and she started to get into prostitution and abusing drugs. Over the years, her addictions and her sex work, she actually did face quite a few convictions. She was arrested dozens and dozens of times. And by 1997, she had these 3 children and her fiance, but she was still a sex worker because she was finding it very hard to find a job with the charges that she had, having to explain what she was convicted for, and she just was doing what she felt that she needed to do to support her family. But despite her line of work, this is a mother that we're talking about. And if you asked anyone, even down to the people on the other side of the law, people who were arresting her, social workers, they would all describe her as a very bright, young, charming woman. One article said, quote, "Take away her criminal record and Hayes was indistinguishable from any other doting mother. She read to them at night, dressed up in costumes with them on Halloween, took them to Celebration Station. If she promised one child a birthday at Chuck E. Cheese, she honored that promise, even if it meant returning to the street to pay for that treat." Her daughter's teachers described her as the mother that showed up. With that being said, if any of you want to continue to judge this woman, just screw you. I don't really know what else to say. We'll learn later that Roxanne was often described by the media simply by her occupation and not by the person that she actually was. So on February 19th of 1997, Roxanne ended up at the home of Lawrence Singleton. And because, spoiler alert, we don't get to know Roxanne's side of the story, we only really get to hear what Lawrence said happened, and who freaking knows how true that is. He says that Roxanne showed up to his house to perform oral sex for $20. After it was finished, he said that she got enraged and that she threatened to decapitate him, which, Lawrence, just stop. You're doing too much, man. Anyway, he said that at some point a knife came into play and they both struggled over the knife, and unfortunately she was accidentally stabbed 7 times in her face, chest, and stomach. Like, are you being sarcastic? He really just thought that this was a great thing to say to police and that people would believe him. Come on, you don't accidentally stab someone 7 times. Now, this part is just wild to me. Lawrence's neighbors are the real MVPs because one of Lawrence's Florida neighbors happened to go over there for something. And when he answered the door, his chest and his face was just covered in blood. And when the neighbor peeked inside, he saw a woman lying on the floor, completely lifeless. And that is when he called police, and Lawrence Singleton was arrested once again. Lawrence was 69 years old at this point. Rightly so, the public was completely outraged. This was one of those instances where they just kind of looked and with the "I told you so" look, we knew this would happen. It was only a matter of time. We told you. It was ridiculous that you were releasing him for good behavior. People were pissed. Governor Wilson of Florida said, quote, "This man should never, ever have been released from prison. He was clearly dangerous, and I think he's an animal," end quote. Now, rightly so, Mary Vincent was kind of thrown back into this. She was able to have the opportunity to be a part of something that would put him away forever. She decided to come and talk about her own experience with Lawrence Singleton for herself, for Roxanne, for Roxanne's family, and to put this guy away for the rest of forever, or at least that was the hope. After he was arrested for the murder of Roxanne Hayes, Mary really got thrown back into the depths of her PTSD. She would wake up from nightmares in the middle of the night just screaming bloody murder. She was always looking over her shoulder, worried that he would find her and do the job that he promised at her trial. Because remember, when he was at her trial, he looked at her and said he'll finish the job if it takes him the rest of his life. So she really, it's like she was coming down off of all of this adrenaline that she had been living in for years of constantly looking over her shoulder. Ultimately, Lawrence Singleton was charged with first-degree murder. Now, in the state of Florida, luckily, they allow the death sentence, and he was sentenced to death. But unfortunately, before he could have his sentence carried out, while sitting on death row, he was diagnosed with cancer and ultimately died from it. Lawrence Singleton died never having admitted his guilt, never having apologized to Mary, never having to admitting the things that he had done. Now, although it took things that it shouldn't have taken to get to this point, Mary Vincent's attack did end up changing state legislature. So in the state of California, as we know, the crimes that he committed against Mary Vincent, the maximum sentence was 14 years. Well, after her attack, they ended up changing that, and it increased to 25 years to life. And although Mary Vincent has lived an extremely difficult life filled with trauma and PTSD, she was ultimately able to move on with her life. She went on to have 2 sons of her own. She began doing artwork that depicted female characters as superheroes. She also started tinkering around with refrigerator parts and different appliances and stuff to make her own prosthetics because they're so expensive. And so she really just came to this point in her life where She just wanted to be left alone. She was ready to leave everything behind her, and I really hope that she was able to find that peace. Also, to Roxanne Hayes, her daughter was 11 or 12 years old at the time of her murder. She's obviously much older now, but I hope that her children were able to find some peace. Her daughter was a very big advocate as a very young child to make sure that people knew that she had a name. A lot of headlines said Lawrence Singleton kills prostitute, and she wants to make it very known that her mother's name was Roxanne Hayes. So I hope that everyone remembers the names Mary Vincent and Roxanne Hayes, and I hope that their families are finding peace at this point in their lives. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for another bedtime. Joining us, I say us like there's multiple of us here. Thank you for joining me for another bedtime story. I hope you sleep tight. If you're like me, you're just constantly listening to true crime, and somehow you're still able to sleep. So I hope you guys have a great night. Thank you so much. If you want to just listen to bedtime stories, you can go to the channel's page and click on the bedtime stories playlist. I know I do a lot of random things, so if you don't like those things, just click on that playlist. And I will see you next time.